I'd like to begin by celebrating and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, elders, and their ancestors, the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet this evening, and extend that respect to First Nations peoples, elders, and ancestors from elsewhere across the country. My name is Toni Erskine, and I'm a professor in the International Relations Department at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs here at the ANU. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. A lot of you have been coming along to the seminars and the public lectures that we've been organizing as part of this project. I want to welcome you to our AI, Automated Systems, and the Future of War public lecture series, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. So this lecture is part of a 2.5-year project called Anticipating the Future of War, AI, Automated Systems, and Resort to Force Decision-Making, generously funded by the Australian government through a grant from Defence. If you'd like to know more about the project, we've put publications that have resulted from the project on the table just outside the lecture theatre. Please feel free to help yourself. Now, one of the participants in this project, since it started 2 years ago, has been Major General Mick Ryan, who I have the honor of introducing as our distinguished lecturer here this evening. Now, I can't think of a more urgent time than now to try to understand the future of war and the emerging technologies that will increasingly define it. And I also can't think of anyone with more experience and expertise than Mick to help us with this understanding. Now, Mick spent 35 years in the Australian Army, where he commanded soldiers at troop, squadron, regiment, task force, and brigade levels. He served in East Timor, in Iraq, and Afghanistan, as well as on the U.S. Joint Staff in Washington, D.C. Mick is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College, the U.S. Marine Corps School of Advanced Warfighting, and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mick is also an accomplished author. His book, War Transformed, was published in 2022. What I believe was his first book of fiction, White Sun War, The Campaign for Taiwan, was published in 2023. And his latest book, the timely The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire, was published in August 2024. And Mick has actually just given me a copy of the book, which is on the table right where I'll be sitting. When it comes to publishing, as in all areas, it's incredibly difficult to keep up with Mick. Mick runs his own strategic advisory company and is a strategic advisor to several Australian and US companies. He's also the inaugural Senior Fellow for Military Studies at the Lowy Institute in Sydney and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Tonight, we have the great privilege of hearing him talk about supercharging adaptation, AI, and war in the 21st century. Mick is going to speak, I think, for about 30 minutes, and then he'll take questions from the audience. Mick, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I'll pass things over to you.
Thanks, Toni. Great to be back here at Headley Ball. I've been here once or twice before, and there's some very familiar faces in here who are absolute joy for me to see out here. Hopefully you feel the same about me at the end of my talk. Before I start, just thank you once again to Toni and the team, not just for bringing me here, but allowing me to go on this journey over the last couple of years in this very important project. I've had the opportunity to be exposed to some amazing ideas and just profoundly insightful people from all over the world. So thank you for that. I guess a couple of caveats before I begin. If you've read my writing, you'll understand I'm not an academic, but I do have some ideas that I like to write about. I'm not a technologist, I'm not a coder. I come at AI from a user perspective. And an organisational change perspective. And finally, you may have already noticed, I don't have any slides, which for a military guy is very, very unusual. So surprise, I have 0 slides. I'm not going to wander and talk as I normally do. I'm just going to talk at you, with hopefully some new ideas or confirming some old ideas and probably a combination of the two. But my journey of learning about adaptation began over 2 decades ago. In fact, just over 22 years ago, I returned from 2 years at Quantico, where I attended the Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the School of Advanced Warfighting. Now, when I returned, I was posted to the Military Strategy branch in Russell offices. Now, as we know, in Russell offices, generally, the most important functions share the 5th floor with the CDF and Secretary. And in those days, Military Strategy branch was on the 5th floor, which I believe is no longer the case. Now, early in my time there, my boss, the brilliant, and I mean this, the brilliant John Blackburn, asked me to take a brief from a DSTO scientist. It wasn't called DSTG in those days. Now, at the appointed time, the equally brilliant, if more so, Dr. Anne-Marie Grisogono, turned up for a half-hour briefing on her research on adaptation in the military. Well, being a scientist, there was no way a briefing was going to last just 30 minutes. I recall at the 2-hour mark asking, how much longer is the briefing going to go? Now, you might wonder why I asked her at the 2-hour mark and why I waited that long. Well, the reason was I was being exposed to something new and entirely fascinating, and ever since, I've sought to learn and apply the theories of adaptation, complex adaptive systems, and organisational change in my command and staff appointments. I based the concept of operations for our first reconstruction task force in Afghanistan on learning and adaptation. As the lead staff officer in the Army's Adaptive Army Initiative in 2008 and 2009, the combination of theoretical knowledge and practical application was crucial. And since then, I've continued to write about it, study it in theory and on the ground in places like Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and of course in our own military institutions. Now, the interaction of military forces, be it for training activities in peacetime or the most violent interaction in war, provides many opportunities for individuals and institutions to learn. Learning and adaptation is one of the ways that military commanders and institutions seek to reduce uncertainty and the potential for tactical and strategic surprise. But as the multi-millennia history of military affairs demonstrates, not every military organisation has the learning culture necessary to recognise the need for change and then conduct disciplined, multi-level adaptation. It demands an array of different leadership, training, educational, technological and cultural elements that are put in place and practiced in peace so that the institution may be reflexively adaptive when war eventually occurs. This learning and adaptation culture is perhaps the most important element of a military organisation. The ability to adapt has always been crucial, but the pace of 21st century technological and geopolitical change makes it more important than ever. The events of last week in Europe are just one example of this. Now, rapid technological change is driving faster adaptation cycles, but it also provides part of the solution to the challenge of recognising change, developing solutions and testing them, sharing them, and repeating that process constantly and consistently. In the past decade, as part of the impact of artificial intelligence, it's become clearer and more compelling. It's occurred to me that in meshing adaptation theory and AI, we might provide an even better way for individuals and institutions to learn, adapt, improve and succeed in modern strategic competition and war. Now, AI offers the chance to improve all aspects of adaptive cycles for individuals, institutions and nations, but it also offers the chance to understand and interfere with enemy adaptation cycles in an approach I call Counter Adaptation. And the aim of this is to degrade the impact of adversary learning communities such as the one we've seen emerge between Russia, Iran, North Korea and China. So the aim of my talk this evening is to propose an evolved concept for multi-level military adaptation through the fusion of new learning processes and AI, with the aim of speeding up and enhancing the quality of military adaptation and strategic decision-making in peace and war. Now, the exploration of adaptation by military institutions has resulted in the development of a range of concepts that underpin the understanding of how adaptation occurs and how it can be applied. One of these is the concept of adaptation cycles. Now, in military literature, the best known adaptive cycle is Colonel John Boyd's OODA, or Observe, Orient, Decide, Act loop. Boyd's fascination with gaining advantage through reacting and manoeuvring faster than an opponent was to constitute the basis for nearly everything he thought and did later. Boyd's 1976 paper, Destruction and Creation, synthesised his ideas and theories to that date. His 1977 Patterns of Conflict, Warp 10, briefly contained the start of the OODA loop philosophy. He continued to develop his thesis until the mature OODA loop concept appeared in 1978 briefing entitled Patterns of Conflict, Warp 12. Boyd's work has had significant influence in the military institutions of the United States and many other countries. By the late 1980s, Boyd's concept received advocacy from theorist William Lind and US Marine Corps General Al Gray, who became the Commandant. The advocacy by Lind and Gray, widespread debate within and outside the Marine Corps, and the ideas of Boyd finally coalesced in the publication of at least one seminal publication called Warfighting in 1989. But they weren't the other ones to see the value in this theory. The 2009 publication by the Australian Army called Adaptive Campaigning examined the short, medium-term applications of adaptation on the battlefield and in military support functions. It proposed an adaptation cycle based on the premise that the complexities of the modern battle space are such that it cannot be understood by remote analysis alone. Rather, detailed situational understanding can only flow from physical interaction with the problem, and success is achieved by learning from this interaction. But what does this look like in practice? Well, I think there's 5 things that need to occur. First, military institutions must build and sustain environmental awareness. This includes fields such as geopolitics, national policy, demography, technology, and national and institutional relationships. Second, they must develop a view of what is likely to succeed in that environment, from the tactical to the strategic levels. The development of this view of what is likely to result in success and the extensive testing of such views by military organisations is crucial. Third, military organisations need to make changes that get them closer to their view of fitness and learn from those changes. This includes new and evolved doctrine and organisations. Fourth, they have to retain and share knowledge in themselves and in individuals about the information that improves their chances of success. This includes the ability to collect and absorb lessons, disseminate the implications of those lessons, and continue to learn based on the interaction of the institution with its environment. And finally, military organisations need to measure success and failure of engagement with the environment. This is the capacity of an organisation to gauge its actions in moving towards its definitions of fitness, which leads to further change in institutional and individual actions, objectives, and notions of suitability. Now, modern technology and the new wars of the 21st century have sped this process up to historically unprecedented speeds. Uncrewed systems with growing AI capabilities have been at the forefront of many examinations of adaptation in the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Multiple studies have examined not only the massive expansion in the number of drones used in war, but the extraordinary fast learning and adaptation cycles in the improvement of drone capabilities and the expanding number of functions they're used for. As Alexandra Malloy, joining us in the audience tonight, notes in a recent study of drones from the Ukraine war, the rapidly evolving nature of modern warfare in Ukraine necessitates an accelerated cycle of innovation, which currently ranges from a week to approximately 3 months. Now, there are other examples of rapid innovation and adaptation in modern war. The Ukrainian capacity to mesh civil and military sensor networks and analytical capability on the battlefield, in the air defence environment and in national security endeavours elsewhere is another important case study of adaptation. So too are Russian developments to improve their electronic warfare capacity, to degrade the performance of Western precision munitions and minimise the impact of different kinds of Ukrainian drones on the front line as well as deep inside Russia. Now, more recently, we've seen the reports about Israel's use of AI to speed up its targeting cycle and the Pentagon's application of AI to enhance what it calls its kill chains. In the past month, we've also been surprised by the emergence of the DeepSeek R1 AI, which, when copied by Western developers, may offer cheaper AI much closer to the coalface for many military institutions. But despite these advances, adaptation does not always guarantee success. Systems have demonstrated adaptive capacity but have still suffered partial or catastrophic failure. For example, the US Army, which demonstrated the capacity to adapt to the Cold War Central European front and used the tactics and equipment developed there successfully against Iraq in 1991, then failed to quickly recognise changed circumstances after capturing Baghdad in 2003. In the Russian system, collecting and sharing lessons is exacerbated by a fear of reporting failure and a culture of centralised command. This was examined in an excellent Royal United Services Institute report on the lessons of the war in Ukraine in November 2022 and subsequent reports. The report described how the reporting culture of the Russian army was deficient because it does not encourage honest reporting of failures. Anyone who is perceived to have failed is normally replaced or punished. For more senior leaders in the army, failure can result in important missions being stripped from the organisation they command. Now, we'll come back to this because this provides useful, targetable vulnerabilities, which I'll go into in some detail. But before I go to that, I'd like to talk about how wartime adaptation is built on peacetime developments. Learning and adaptation isn't just a wartime concern. War is normally only a very small proportion of the life of any military professional. Many military personnel can spend their entire careers in a military organisation and not participate in an operational deployment. More importantly, it is the processes, technologies, leadership philosophies and cultures put in place between wars that provide the foundation for military effectiveness and adaptation in war. In general, we should remember that the military institution that a nation begins a war with is almost never the military institution that it wins it with. Monitoring the readiness of a military institution between wars, a process that has traditionally been subject to gaming, as well as process and data corruption, can also be vastly improved with new approaches to ensure governments and senior military leaders better understand their deterrence and defence capabilities. Decision-making on other peacetime functions, such as testing options for different force structures and equipment procurements, training and education, logistics and personnel management, and the strategic management of alliance interactions might also be improved in peacetime through the better processes using AI. But this also applies to our adversaries. Potential enemy states are rapidly absorbing and deploying new technologies and their associated new doctrines, which must be understood by us and countered in peace and war. Russia has demonstrated a capable, if uneven, ability to learn and adapt in Ukraine. China has demonstrated a well-developed adaptive stance over the last couple of decades. But the question is this: how might we influence and degrade their capacity to learn and adapt? Now, in their 1990 book, Military Misfortunes, Elliot Cohen and John Gooch explored significant military failures over the past 100 years, producing fail matrices that identify the critical pathways to misfortune and failure. In seeking to adopt a more systemic approach to their analysis of failure, Cohen and Gooch defined the three types of errors that can result in either simple or complex failure: a failure to learn, a failure to anticipate, or a failure to adapt. Counter Adaptation seeks to induce this failure to adapt, or at least prevent effective change in our adversaries. It's informed Counter adaptation that is informed by AI would need to focus on attacking the 5 elements of adaptation that I described earlier. These operations would seek to deny an adversary the capacity to effectively adapt to a friendly force's strategy, presence and activities. This would reduce an adversary's range of options against friendly forces, as well as degrade the enemy's fitness for operations and their capacity to influence our activities. Now, I think this counter-adaptation has 5 components. First, it has to degrade an adversary's environmental awareness, and this is to ensure that they have a qualitatively poorer awareness of the environment than friendly forces do. Examples include deception, signature management and information operations. Next, it must influence an adversary's notions of fitness. Third, it needs to shape, influence and corrupt change mechanisms. We must induce in our competitors and adversaries what Peter Senge has called organisational learning disability. Given the current techno-authoritarian learning community between Iran, North Korea, Russia and China, this focus must be on corrupting international as well as national learning systems. Fourth, we need to corrupt sources of enemy corporate lessons. A competitor's ability to adapt to friendly force operations is reliant on their capacity to collect and then disseminate information about our activities. Interfering with this ability to learn more about friendly operations and denying their capacity to share what they do learn are essential. Now, I'd like to turn to some of the risks of using algorithmic support in adaptation. I've talked about where we might use it to interfere with the adaptation of others, but what are some of the risks? Well, in a recent investigation of Israeli use of AI in its Gaza operations in 2023 and 2024, it was found that the headquarters of the Israeli Defence Force, in seeking to cope with the war's rapid tempo, turned to an elaborate artificial intelligence tool called Habsora, or the Gospel, which could quickly generate hundreds of additional targets. However, critics have proposed that the focus on AI in intelligence analysis and in targeting was one of the reasons why Israel was surprised by Hamas on 7 October 2023. Human analysts who'd warned of the Hamas attacks were ignored because the algorithmic assessments had not provided the same findings. And in generating so many targets so quickly, there is unlikely to be sufficient humans to validate all such targets, thereby increasing the risk of increased civilian casualties. Now, there's an array of other risks with algorithmic support to adaptation as well. One risk is the user adoption of AI for supporting analysis and decision-making about adaptation is too low to make a viable contribution. This might be the result of a lack of trust by users, or that user interfaces are too complex. This could be addressed by building enhanced technological literacy in an institution, as well as better design of the kinds of command and control and decision support tools being used by people in military organisations. Now, a second risk is corruption of data or analytical AI used in the adaptation process. This could be caused by environmental factors such as damage to servers, by weather or adversary action, always a risk on operations. But it also might be the result of deliberate intrusion and attack by state or non-state actors. While security protocols will be critical to addressing this, so too will basic cyber hygiene training for people. Ultimately, this will be a risk for any organisation that actively employs AI in its decision support processes. The ultimate manifestation of this risk would be an adversary corrupting the AI-supported adaptation processes without our knowledge, and that this results in increasingly maladaptive processes at different levels of our organisation. Another risk is that multitudes of different programs to acquire different AI for institutional functions, algorithms that support learning and adaptation, are given a low priority and essentially slip to the back of the line for funding. Now, this has been a constant challenge in many training and education programs in military organisations, and there are many precedents for such behaviour. Now, in addressing these risks, it's also necessary to define where AI should not be used in adaptation support. There are a range of authorities and responsibilities currently assigned to humans, such as the authorities for lethal force, or life-saving medical decisions, or even crucial strategic and political decisions that may be carved out and not assigned to AI as a final arbiter. Now, the foundational hypothesis of my talk this evening is that all these aspects of military and national adaptation processes might be significantly improved by meshed human-AI adaptation. To achieve this, I propose there are 5 elements in which military and national security institutions might wish to invest their time, people, and technology. The first element is to embrace adaptation in the institutional culture. Adaptation, if it's to have a strategic rather than a local influence, normally doesn't just happen. It must be led. While there are individual imperatives in some circumstances for rapid learning and adaptation, which is where the term adapt or die comes from, even these most immediate of learnings can and should be shared to enhance the overall survivability of teams and larger formations. Senior commanders and other leaders must nurture people and formations that are actively learning and capable of changing where it's safe and effective to do so. This culture must begin with clear statements about the leadership environment and its tolerance for risk and new ideas. What leaders can and should do at every level to observe, collect, record and share lessons about combat and non-combat aspects of military affairs must be well defined and disseminated widely. Now, this must be also accompanied by definitions for acceptable failure, because failure is an integral part of learning. The tolerance levels for failure are likely to be different at the various levels of military endeavour. For example, at the tactical level, there may be a greater tolerance for failure because the opportunities for learning are greater and the consequences for failure are less serious than what they are at the higher levels. However, there will also be areas where failure cannot be tolerated, such as in the unnecessary death of non-combatants or destruction of strategic assets, or in strategic decision-making where the stakes are much, much higher than on the battlefield. These intolerable failures should also be clarified. Now, adaptive incentive frameworks will be required to encourage risk-taking to improve military effectiveness. In essence, military organisations must mature their institutional cultures so that they approximate what Martin Dempsey has described in No Time for Spectators as responsible rebellion. Now, a second element in the adoption of AI for learning and adaptation is to scale AI support from individual to the institution. There is unlikely to be a one-size-fits-all algorithm or process that can enhance learning and adaptation at every level of military endeavour. For example, the processes and context for the interaction of politicians and senior military leaders in policy and strategy discussions is very different from that of a tactical leader in the land, sea and air domains. Therefore, a virtual arms room of different adaptation support algorithms will be necessary in any institution-wide approach to adaptation. At the tactical level, these algorithms will need to be very simple to train people on them, otherwise they won't use them, and easier to use by people who are tired, hungry and under constant time pressure. Strategic level adaptation tools must support strategic level decision making in peace and war about force size and structure, readiness and posture, options for different capabilities to achieve strategic effects, and the foundational strategic wargaming that underpins decision making. These tools are likely to be very, very different to those used at lower levels, but must be linked to them. AI-enabled adaptation systems will also be needed that better aggregate the multitude of lower-level observations and quickly communicate them to the right assessment agencies. We must use AI to build better learning communities inside our international alliances as well. And as such, I propose that algorithmic supported adaptation should be a pillar of AUKUS. Could be pillar 2, could be its own pillar. A third element is to know where adaptation relevant data is found, stored and shared. Now, in his 2018 book, The Fifth Risk, Michael Lewis writes about how AI has been used to better manage farmland and predict weather in America. While the algorithms that underpin this were important, more crucial was the process to discover, connect, and apply data sets from many different sources across the country, including lost basements and older computers. This is also the case in military institutions. Over the past decade, military institutions, as well as other government agencies, have discovered they possess vast troves of digital data, but have generally been poor stewards of that data. Data is held in different formats, in different security classifications, with firewalls between different nations, services, and commands. An enhanced adaptive stance in military organisations must have enhanced data awareness as a foundation. And while institutional measures will be an important element, it will also require data discipline in tactical units and by individuals. As such, data awareness and management will need to become one of the basic disciplines taught to military personnel. For example, a soldier in the field, as part of their morning routine, will potentially need to add a data assurance check for their digital systems, as well as their daily weapon clean. The key challenge moving forward will not be finding enough data in this environment. It will be finding the right data that is accessible to the user community that needs it. Now, the fourth element is to set and evolve measures of effectiveness. If AI-supported adaptation is to work effectively, there must be measures of effectiveness to guide the direction adaptation takes and where the best AI investments might be made. At the tactical and operational level, winning battles more often is a crude yet proven method of measuring success, but a more sophisticated approach is required because not every military activity is a battle. At the strategic and political levels, AI-supported adaptation process might be capable of measuring improvements in civil-military interaction and decision-making. This may be one of the most vital functions of AI-supported adaptive processes. In peace and war, no single strategic decision is purely military or purely civilian or purely political. AI should not only be supporting these interactions, but also used to support learning about the interaction in civil-military relations and to assist in finding areas where interaction and decision-making might be improved. Indeed, AI might become an entirely new sub-theme in the broader study of civil-military relations. The final and fifth element is military process and doctrine stripping and reform. The observation and absorption of lessons needs to be part of normal military interaction rather than a separate and parallel ecosystem that often has difficulty inserting itself into strategic decision-making. Military institutions have made progress in this regard in recent decades, although as Ukraine, Israel and Russia have demonstrated over the last few years, this can still be a very uneven process depending on the risk that personnel are facing and the priorities that are given by leaders. Tactical learning must be intimately connected with strategic learning, and the two must have an interactive, two-way relationship. Technology can provide for this in many ways, but human processes must also evolve to improve this interaction. Procurement and personnel decision-making processes, which remain heavily reliant on humans and groups to reach decisions and assign priorities, must evolve with the support of algorithmic learning support tools. Crucially, the reduction of time and the number of senior defence committees might be needed to speed up decision-making processes, but this can only be led from the top. Government ministers and star-ranked officers must be capable and willing to lead a very different acceptance of risk in defence and military processes. Concurrently, these senior military and civilian leaders must better define acceptable failure in the learning processes and accept more decision-making at more junior levels in the interests of faster adaptation. Now, in conclusion, military organisations, or at least those that wish to succeed in competition and conflict, cannot stand still. Military institutions need to be constantly adapting at different levels, and they must absorb AI-supported adaptive processes in peacetime that can then be applied to improve adaptation at multiple levels in war. At the same time, military forces and the wider national security enterprise must be constantly interfering with the capacity of our competitors and adversaries to do the same. This forms an ongoing adaptation battle and is one that is conducted at every level of military and national security activities. Now, despite all the technology, war remains a human endeavour, albeit one that is continually evolving with the impacts of different warfighting ideas, geopolitics, and indeed some new and very interesting technologies. And it will demand continued investment in the ideas and the institutions that make up the military instrument of national power. But ultimately, the reforms necessary to implement a meshed human-AI adaptive stance to improve decision-making at all levels will require visionary and disciplined leadership, and that is something no algorithm can provide. Thank you.